Welcome to the Whispering Dark. Do you ever feel a coldness crawl down your spine? A feeling that something unseen is watching? Tonight, we delve into the shadows where nightmares become reality. Don't turn off the lights. You might not like what you see. So, settle in close and prepare to be chilled.
He resided in a ramshackle hut atop a desolate hill, shunned by all. His identity remained a mystery, his age unknown, and his origins obscured in shadow. If he once had kin in the vicinity, they had long vanished or maintained a discreet distance from the pariah. Whenever encountered on the roads or amidst the fields, people averted their gazes, some uttering prayers while others whispered protective charms steeped in ancient lore. Occasionally, children would mock him, daring ones even hurling stones, but their antics ceased at the approach of adults. It was common knowledge that glimpsing the nameless figure or spending even a moment in his presence invited ill fortune. The Sin Eater was but one among the myriad bogeymen invoked by weary parents to instill obedience in unruly children. Yet, unlike the others, he was real. His singular purpose was clear, and when his services were required, the denizens of the region did not have to seek him out. Some enigmatic force guided the Sin Eater to homes where wakes were held. There, he partook of a humble meal from a wooden bowl placed upon the deceased's chest, shouldering the burden of their sins, be they of man, woman, or child. It was believed that this ritual hastened the soul's journey through purgatory to the gates of paradise. Upon finishing his repast, the Sin Eater retreated to his hovel, marking the conclusion of the solemn rite. The vessel, meticulously crafted for the occasion, was always consigned to flames thereafter. He is the final vestige of a bygone era, reflected the parish priest, a sorrowful gesture accompanying his words. He often lamented the waning influence of ancient customs, even as they clashed with his own faith. Yet, more than that, he longed to alleviate the plight of the pariah on the hill, the most downtrodden among his congregation. In the current state of affairs, he could only offer what little aid he could muster. As was tradition, the parish priest left sustenance for the Sin Eater by the churchyard gate on the first day of each month. Reverend Monkton now stood, awaiting the arrival of the nameless figure, sensing a duty to ensure the provisions did not fall into the hands of any passing vagabond. A fine mist descended, the lingering aftermath of storms that had swept across the Welsh hills to the west. "I truly believe you indulge these folks' superstitions," grumbled the squire, who had come to converse with his old acquaintance and harbored disdain for any concessions to antiquated beliefs. Sir John Prescott was a progressive thinker, championing science, education, and advancement. He played a pivotal role in bringing the railway and telegraph to his secluded corner of Herefordshire. Unsurprisingly, Sir John viewed sin-eating, along with witchcraft and fortune-telling, as antiquated remnants of the Dark Ages. In the year of our Lord 1889, an era of enlightenment, with the British Empire actively spreading civilization across the globe, no respectable Victorian gentleman could ignore the backwardness lingering among the English peasantry. Thanks to his forward-looking approach, Sir John ensured his tenants had access to clean water and their children received proper schooling. The squire even attempted vaccination, relenting only when cautioned by the priest that it could provoke open rebellion. There had already been murmurs of dissent when a steam thresher was introduced during harvest time. Thus, reluctantly, Sir John postponed the vaccination program. "You're rather harsh on these folks, my friend," remarked the priest, broaching the familiar subject. "They hold fast to their familiar rituals in a rapidly changing uncertain world. We all seek solace, especially when we feel powerless over our destinies. And let's not forget, tradition is what upholds our privileged positions in our small community, just as it holds that poor soul in his. Monckton gestured toward the hills, and Sir John gazed out into the drizzle. True to the priest's observation, the sin-eater approached. The figure moved like a living scarecrow, a gaunt form draped in tattered garments, hobbling along the muddy country lane that passed by the church. With his head bowed, the brim of a slouch hat shielding his features, the majority of which were obscured by an unkempt mass of hair and beard. "Appalling," scoffed Sir John. "Such a pitiful, deranged individual should be under care in a hospital or asylum, not wandering wild in the hills." With a disdainful snort, the landowner turned away and retreated into the church. The priest remained on the porch, sheltered from the rain, observing as the nameless man partook of his meal just beyond the bounds of consecrated ground. Monckton understood that the sin-eater, relegated to a status lower than a leper, could never breach the sanctity of holy places. Indeed, the outcast was barred from entering any abode of respectable folk, save for the singular occasion when he fulfilled his role in rural society. The outcast completed his modest repast before straightening up, his gaze directed towards the church porch where the priest stood observing. Despite the ragged slouch hat obscuring his face, Monckton discerned a faint glimmer in the depths of the man's sunken eyes. Does he truly believe it? Monckton pondered. Does he genuinely sense the sins of the departed infiltrating his body, his soul, with each mouthful of that meager meal? Such thoughts bordered on heresy, yet his faith must rival my own, at least in strength. Ah, but the wretched soul! The priest felt an urge to approach the gate, to converse with the sin-eater, to inquire about his life, his struggles, perhaps extend some spiritual comfort. But prudence prevailed. His parishioners would surely take notice. Attendance at his services would dwindle. Monckton would risk losing credibility, maybe even face ostracism from some of the more traditional members. He had witnessed such consequences befalling imprudent clergy in the past. The nameless man who bore the burden of others' transgressions was inherently deemed malevolent. How could he be anything else, bearing such a weight of sin within him? Engaging with him would be akin to contaminating oneself with the sins he carried. Thus, the priest offered a tentative greeting, raising his hand in acknowledgement. Initially, the man beyond the churchyard displayed no response to the gesture. Then, the sin-eater nodded, turned, and retraced his steps. Soon, he disappeared from view, and the priest entered the church to rejoin his companion. "Back to his den, has he?" inquired Sir John, rising stiffly from the bench. "Retreated like an animal to his burrow. Bah! No matter how destitute he may appear, he remains a human, a child of God, possessing an immortal soul just like you and I," gently admonished the priest. For a moment, the squire seemed on the verge of taking offense at the comparison to a ragged simpleton at the bottom of society's ladder. But Sir John could never sustain anger towards his friend for long. He grinned and playfully punched the priest's shoulder. "Indeed, you're correct, Philip," he conceded with a touch of embarrassment. "I sometimes forget my Christian duty. You do what you can for that unfortunate soul, just as I endeavor to aid the villagers. Yet it's challenging to uplift people who seem so entrenched in medieval superstition. Let's shift our focus, John," suggested the priest, leading his friend through to the vestry where they could converse without interruption. Monckton produced a bottle of whiskey and poured them both a drink, as he often did to ward off the chill. as he would say. A brief silence followed as they savored the single malt. "Now that's what the Scots would call a good swally," remarked Sir John. "Indeed," agreed the priest, refilling their glasses. "Sometimes a nice, hot cup of tea just doesn't hit the spot." Sir John, whose spirits had lifted with the whiskey, furrowed his brow. "True, but we mustn't overlook the harm strong drink can bring. Philip," he cautioned. Monckton sighed, recognizing that another sensitive issue had emerged. "I gather Victor isn't faring well in his medical pursuits?" inquired the priest. The squire's nephew, taken in after his parents perished in a shipwreck returning from India, had long been a concern for Sir John. As an elderly bachelor set in his ways, he had struggled to raise his younger brother's son with the right blend of kindness and discipline. Sir John aimed to instill honesty and diligence in Victor, while Monckton endeavored to nurture his Christian values. Yet both efforts had proven fruitless. Before Victor departed for London, there had been several unsavory incidents involving servant girls, which had cost Sir John a tidy sum to resolve. The priest recalled Victor's eyes vividly. They possessed a cunning, sinister quality, almost inhuman, akin to the gaze of a reptile endowed with human intellect. A shiver ran down his spine. "You're putting it rather delicately, Philip," remarked the squire, peering into his whiskey glass. "But it seems the lad has sunk deeper into vice. His studies are neglected. I received word from the teaching hospital, stating he faces expulsion for habitual absenteeism. Instead, he writes to me for funds, only to squander them in the East End on heaven knows what. From the looks of his handwriting, he's taken to drink. Or worse. We're both seasoned individuals," ventured Monckton, attempting tactfulness. "We understand young men must find their outlets one way or another. We had our own escapades in our youth, after all, and there are myriad temptations in London far worse than mere drunkenness." As he spoke, the priest realized he had stumbled. The squire's expression darkened. "No doubt he's contemplating the city's other pitfalls for unsuspecting young men. I ought to change the subject. Perhaps Victor simply isn't suited for a career in surgery?" ventured the priest. Sir John chuckled. "Unfortunate choice of words, but I fear you're correct. Last week, I wrote to him, insisting that he return home and face me, disclose his true aspirations. He should be arriving tomorrow on the midday train. Would you be so kind as to visit in the afternoon, offer me some moral support?" The priest nodded, mustering a strained smile. He had no desire to reconnect with Victor, but he would stand by his friend. "Try to keep your temper in check with the lad, John. It's a challenging journey from boyhood to manhood in this day and age. The youth face pressures we never encountered in more tranquil times." The squire and the priest exchanged a few more words before parting amicably. As Reverend Monckton locked up, he paused at the churchyard gate to inspect the remnants of the Senator's meal. A few crumbs of bread and fruit peel lay in an earthenware bowl, while an old, cracked jug that had once held rough cider sat empty. After a moment's consideration, the priest smashed the bowl and jug against the gatepost, just in case anyone was observing. The following afternoon, the priest set out from his parsonage towards the manor house, hopeful to find the uncle and nephew reconciled, or at least speaking to each other. His path led him through the village, where he exchanged greetings with members of his congregation as they went about their daily activities. Initially, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but soon Monckton noticed a collective movement along the main street, all heading in the same direction as him. What's more, people were dressed in their Sunday finest on a Saturday. the women adorned in elegant bonnets and skirts, the men clad in somber black suits. One loquacious laborer, noticing the priest's perplexed expression, fell into step beside him. "You haven't heard the news, Reverend?" remarked the laborer, eager to deliver the somber tidings. "What news, Jethro?" inquired Moncton. "The squire's nephew has passed away," replied Jethro, relishing his role as bearer of unfortunate news. "Aye," chimed in a woman, joining their conversation. "The lad was discovered deceased by the ticket inspector when the train arrived at Hereford. Found lying on the floor of the carriage, he was... The police brought the body to the hall just before midday." Moncton felt a pang of sorrow for his friend. To lose his only blood relative, his sole heir, in such a manner was a tragic blow indeed. "Excuse me, I must hurry," he said, quickening his pace. The priest arrived at the manor ahead of most of the villagers, though there was still a line of men and women gathered outside the grange, patiently waiting to pay their respects as tradition dictated. To his credit, Sir John stood on the steps of the elegant portico, exchanging words with each of his tenants in turn. Moncton felt a surge of compassion for his dear friend, understanding how much the squire must have longed to retreat from the world at this moment. As the gathered locals made way for the priest, offering murmured greetings and respectful nods, Moncton was keenly aware of their observant eyes. He carefully masked any emotion before the villagers, exchanging nods and handshakes with Sir John before the squire spoke. "Please go inside. He is in dash." Sir John paused, his voice catching. "His body is laid out in the drawing room." With a nod of acknowledgement, Moncton left his friend to receive further condolences from the tenants. A servant silently guided him into the library, where the curtains had been drawn to dim the afternoon sunlight. The flickering glow of oil lamps and candles cast a solemn aura over the form of the young man. Leaning closer, the priest studied the pallid, smooth-shaven countenance. Even in death, there is no rest, he reflected. The deceased always seemed to carry a restless spirit, unable to find peace. One can only hope that he has finally found solace in the embrace of our Savior. Moncton offered a brief prayer, crossing himself over the corpse, then made his way out into the manor's hallway. As he stepped into the corridor, a sudden commotion outside caught his attention. Voices rising in surprise, alarm, perhaps even fear. Hurrying to the doorway, he peered out. The crowd gathered to pay their respects to their squire had swelled. Nearly 100 men and women now assembled outside the grange. They parted as they had done moments ago to allow the priest through, but this time it was not out of reverence. No, they moved hastily aside, some bumping into each other or stumbling, every one of them afraid to draw too near to the sin-eater. The outcast made his slow progress up the driveway toward the grand house, each step seeming to cause him pain, his limp pronounced. Moncton noted the absence of shoes, only tattered rags wrapped around his feet, his clothes filthy and torn. Once again, the broad brim of his hat obscured his features. Sir John made no move to yield to the sin-eater. The nameless man ascended the 3 stone steps onto the portico, halting before the squire. Moncton hastened to his friend's side, gripping Sir John's arm. He felt the tension radiating from the squire and, fearing a confrontation, whispered urgently, "Please, John, allow the man in, I implore you. He poses no threat." Sir John scanned the scene, his expression drained of color. "Philip, how can I permit that creature near the poor lad?" The priest tightened his grip on the squire's arm. "You must, John. They will not forgive you if you refuse. Do this for me, John, if not for yourself. A tense minute passed as the two men locked eyes, unblinking. Monkton could hear murmurs among the tenants gathered outside. The Sin-Eater remained as motionless as the scarecrow he resembled. The priest wondered if the man was even capable of speech. After all, he had been isolated from human contact for decades. "Very well," conceded Sir John, and the priest loosened his grip. The squire turned and briskly entered the manor, instructing a servant to prepare a plate of cold beef for the priest. With the way cleared, the Sin-Eater limped inside and, without needing direction, made his way straight to the library. Monkton followed, finding the man standing over the body, his expression unchanged. "The meal will be served shortly," the priest informed him, though there was no indication the Sin-Eater had heard. What felt like an eternity passed as Monkton wondered why Sir John's kitchen staff was taking so long to prepare such a simple meal. He became aware of the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears and detected an unpleasant odor, one of sweat and decay emanating from the Sin-Eater. A man who had likely gone unwashed for years, if not decades. To his relief, the cook finally arrived with a plate piled high with cold meat, which she handed to the priest before quickly departing without acknowledging the nameless man. She was a local woman. Approaching the table where the body lay, Monkton carefully placed the plate on the young man's narrow chest, then stepped back. The Sin-Eater remained motionless. Monkton pondered if there was a particular invitation he had overlooked. Yet, none of the accounts he had heard mentioned any specific wording required to commence the meal. "I can hardly recite grace," he mused. As more time elapsed, the priest debated whether he should simply depart. Could his presence as a clergyman be hindering the ritual? However, leaving the Sin-Eater alone with his friend's nephew felt like a betrayal of sorts. Uncertain, he stood gazing at the unappetizing fare on the plate. Once again, the pounding of his own heart reverberated in Monkton's ears. Then, amidst the silence, he heard something else. A woman's scream. Perhaps it originated from outside, one of the village women succumbing to hysteria. Abruptly, the screams ceased, leaving Monkton momentarily disoriented. Scanning the room, he found nothing amiss until his gaze returned to the Sin-Eater. The outcast had lifted his gaze from the corpse, fixing it directly on the priest. For the first time, his face bore a distinct, unmistakable expression, utter despair. His sunken eyes seemed to reflect the anguish of a damned soul, causing the priest to momentarily question his deepest beliefs. What if it's true? Monkton pondered. Perhaps this man does indeed absorb the sins of the departed, sentencing himself to a form of hell on earth. Taking a step back, the priest instinctively raised a hand in a defensive gesture. The Sin-Eater offered a faint smile, barely visible amidst the tangle of his unkempt beard. Then, without ceremony, the nameless man bent over the corpse and began consuming the meat with grimy fingers. Monkton averted his gaze, attempting to block out the unsettling sounds of chewing and swallowing. "No, it's all absurd," Monkton reassured himself, attempting to dispel the unease gripping him. Ridiculous to be so unsettled by this. While one must respect the beliefs of the less educated, steadfastness in matters of faith is paramount. This is pure superstition. Before long, the ancient ritual concluded, and the Sin-Eater stood briefly, wiping grease from his hands in silence. Then, without so much as a glance backward, he departed, passing the priest unnoticed. Once again, The villagers made way for the outcast as he made his way down the driveway and vanished from the grounds. With his departure, a collective sigh of relief swept through the onlookers, their relief palpable as the sin-eater disappeared along the road toward his hovel in the hills. Quiet conversation resumed, tempered by the solemnity of the occasion, yet tinged with a sense of relief. The ritual had been observed, and both priest and squire had paid homage to the traditions of old. Following the sin-eater outside, Monkton raised his hands for attention, adopting his most dignified tone. "Dear people, we thank you for your presence and condolences for Sir John. He is deeply appreciative of your kindness, but requests your understanding as he seeks solace through private prayer and reflection on this somber day." The locals departed, nodding in agreement, and the priest contemplated the possibility of Sir John embracing innovation in the future, perhaps even considering vaccinations for the villagers next year. Returning indoors, he sought out his friend and found him in the drawing room, staring at a pile of luggage before him. "His belongings?" Monkton inquired, gesturing toward the bags. Sir John nodded, his expression heavy with grief. "Do they know the cause of his death?" The squire looked up, tears welling in his eyes. The police found a bottle of poison beneath the railway carriage seat during their investigation. It was easy for him to obtain from the medical school. "Suicide." Monkton started, but his words faltered. Sir John rose abruptly, avoiding his friend's gaze. "Philip, could you look through his belongings for me? I cannot bring myself to do it. He was my brother's son, and I promised to safeguard him. Perhaps you'll find something that sheds light on this tragic event." The squire pleaded, his voice trembling. Sir John's tone faltered, his grief palpable. "If you cannot find an explanation, I'll have no choice but to believe that Victor took his own life rather than confront me, my anger, my lack of understanding. Please, find another explanation." For a while, the priest sat alone, contemplating the meager collection of possessions. Eventually, he mustered the strength to open the first travel bag and began his search. Yet, despite his efforts, he uncovered no diary or letters, nothing that might offer insight into the young man's final days. The contents of the second bag proved equally uninformative. Only the medical bag remained, containing surgical instruments and vials of drugs, as expected. But there's something more here. Monkton reached into a side pocket and retrieved a bundle of folded newspaper clippings. Spreading them out on a nearby table, he quickly discerned the recurring theme. Even in the rural west of England, the sensational news story that had dominated headlines for the past year had not gone unnoticed. The priest scanned the headlines, the familiarity of the phrases chilling him to the core. Has Whitechapel killer claimed new victim? Shocking mutilation of murdered woman. Police taunted by Jack the Ripper. Raising his gaze from the clippings, Monkton returned to the medical student's bag. With deliberate care, he extracted one of the instruments he had noticed earlier, then moved toward the window for a closer examination. Turning it over in the sunlight, he observed faint brown stains adorning the narrow steel blade. "Proves nothing," he muttered to himself. Victor had a vivid imagination, nothing more. Young men often indulge in such macabre fascinations. Returning the scalpel to the bag and securing it, he gathered the newspaper clippings and stowed them in his coat pocket. "We may never understand his motives," he declared, addressing his reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. Then, with more resolve, he added, "Some mysteries are not meant for us to unravel, John. Yet we find solace in the mercy of God, regardless of our sins." That must be our comfort in times of tribulation. Monckton drew a deep breath and prepared to seek out the squire. However, a sudden realization halted him in his tracks. He recalled the moment when the library was filled with screams, just before the Sin Eater undertook his ritual. Assumed his latest burden. Proves nothing, the priest repeated emphatically. Absolutely nothing. He attempted to push aside thoughts of the nameless man shouldering the sins of a monstrous being. For years, the Sin Eater had borne the petty wrongdoings of humble villagers, the ordinary desires, jealousies, and angers of rural life. And he tried to banish the memory of the Sin Eater's face, with eyes devoid of humanity, resembling those of a reptile. No, it's absurd, unscientific, sacrilegious, and I refuse to entertain such notions. Yet, his reflection appeared unconvinced.